Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us. It's so nice to hear all of the conversation rippling through the room. And I want to start promptly this afternoon because we are anticipating a wonderful discussion, and we've got an opportunity for a feast for the eyes following the exhibition, in addition to Sarah's wonderful materials. I'm Anne Collins Goodyear, co-director of the Bowdoin College Museum of Art. And this afternoon, it's a pleasure to welcome, well, really to welcome back, Dr. Sarah Kantor, a scholar of 17th century Baroque art with a specialization in the creators, techniques, materials, and historical patronage of European drawing from the 16th through the 18th centuries. Currently a research fellow at the McGuigan Collection in Harpswell, Maine, and an expert in the work of the 17th century French artist Gaspard Duguay, Sarah has published and lectured widely on the historical European landscape tradition. Her essay, The Theater of Marvels, Danielo Bartoli, Gaspard Duguay, and the Sublime in 17th century landscape painting, will be published next year in the collection Interpretations of Longinus in the Literature, Painted and Printed Imagery of the Early Modern Period. And she is the co-editor with Melissa Ewan of the forthcoming collection Passaggio in Practica, Function in Italian Landscape 1450 to 1700, to be published by Brepols. Her research has been supported by numerous grants and fellowships, including from the Samuel H. Kress Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, Dumbarton Oaks, the Fulbright Foundation, and the University of Maryland, where she received her PhD. Sarah also has substantial experience working in museums, including as the Dorothy J. Del Bueno Curatorial Fellow in Prints, Drawings, and Photographs at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and at the National Gallery of Art as the University of Maryland Museum Fellow. Among her recent publications is James Bowdoin III and Ward Nicholas Boylston in Italy, American Collectors in the later 18th century, which appeared in American Latium, American Artists and Travelers in and around Rome in the age of the Grand Tour. Edited by Karen Wolf, Christopher Johns, and Tommaso Manfredi, the book was published in 2023 by the Accademia Nazionale di San Luca in Rome. As we will hear today, Sarah's research into the collection of James Bowdoin III was originally stimulated by a 2015 Kress Research Fellowship here at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art. Out of her time here came the Bowdoin College Museum of Art's first online scholarly catalog, Art Treasures Gracefully Drawn, James Bowdoin III, and America's Earliest Drawing Collection, published in 2015 and now available through our website. In the context of our current exhibition, Jim Dine, Last Year's Forgotten Harvest, featuring portrait drawings by a renowned contemporary artist. It is a pleasure to have this opportunity to learn more about the historical tradition of drawing in Western art and about the patronage by the Bowdoin family that enables the college it helped launch to boast the very first public collection of drawings in the United States. In conjunction with Sarah's presentation, we are thrilled to be able to share with you in person this afternoon some of the very drawings that James Bowdoin III bequeathed to this institution well over 2 centuries ago. And now, please join me in welcoming Sarah Kantor back to Bowdoin College.
I thank you all for being here, and thank you, Anne, for a wonderful introduction and for inviting me back. to speak a little bit more about research I did. So actually, my interest in Boden's collection began 20 years ago when I was working on my master's thesis on the drawings of Gaspard Duguay. And then in 2015, I was the Kress Research Fellow for the summer, organizing, as Anne mentioned, the first scholarly catalog on the Old Master drawings donated by Boden III. Today, I'm going to begin with the history of the collection, which is based on my essay for the online catalog, talking about Boden's activities as a collector, his place in the history of collecting, and reflect a bit on the role of drawing in education. So start with just a couple of drawings, one of which is on view to see after the talk. So the Boden bequest included 141 drawings that entered the collection in 1811 after the death of James Boden III. And through my research, I was able to prove that this is the first documented collection of drawings in the early Republic and the very first at a university. The drawings range from the 16th to the later 18th century and include a lot of Italian artists, Dutch, as well as some French, German, and a few other nationalities. Some are copies after famous works, some are studies for identified paintings, and all of them provide an understanding on the working processes in the early modern period, as well as exemplifying different techniques of drawings. For the catalog, I researched a selection in detail of about 20 drawings in the time that I had over the summer, mostly drawings by artists that I knew well, but I also took this opportunity to look at works that I was particularly interested in, that I hadn't worked with the artist before, including two of the examples here. And so the first, this workshop of Raphael drawing, tells us about the importance of copying as part of artistic training. So this is a drawing that's after a section of a relief by Donatello, but it was probably not made directly after the relief. It was a copy of a drawing Raphael made himself after this relief that he brought with him to his studio in Rome and had his pupils learn through making copies. And Raphael, rather than focusing on the primary figures in this scene, draws the figures that I have highlighted in red, who are reacting to the miracle that is taking place in the center, which is Saint Anthony literally opening up the chest of a recently deceased man who was apparently very greedy, and showing that his heart was no longer in his chest, because it was in a box of things that he treasured. So a wonderful parable here. But instead of focusing on the corpse being cut open, Raphael picks out women and children who are reacting to what is taking place. And this drawing could be used and reused in compositions, and the figures actually appear in several of Raphael's paintings. It was meant as inspiration. It also brings up the thorny questions of attribution in Raphael's studio, and originally arrived in the collection with an attribution not to Raphael, but to Polidoro da Caravaggio, possibly made by James Boden III himself. Other drawing is Domenico Beccafumi, where we can see him working through the composition, exploring ideas in a preliminary study. And this is for part of a series of frescoes in the Palazzo Pubblico in Siena, the seat of government. And it illustrates an episode from Roman history where a tribune is condemning his colleagues to be burnt alive for trying to overthrow the government. So a warning for anyone thinking the same. All right, so a major part of my fellowship, what I spent quite a bit of time doing, was researching and writing a history of this drawing collection. James Boden III was born into a very wealthy family in Boston, shown here in a portrait with his older sister, Elizabeth, who married John Temple, a British consul general or diplomat. They were the children of James Boden II, He was a merchant as well as amateur scientist who participated in the founding of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in Boston in 1780. He was governor of Massachusetts from 1785 to 87 and owned a very large library, a collection of books that he donated to the American Academy at his death. He owned several works of art as well, mostly family portraits, like we see here, copies of old master paintings, and a few prints, but no documented drawings. Bowdoin III was educated at Harvard, like his father, but left before officially receiving his diploma because of health issues. He then traveled to England in December 1770, enrolled at Oxford, originally intending to study law, but then switched to the King's Riding School, where he was taught French, dancing, and fencing. All of these are for education of the aristocracy rather than preparation for an actual career, as originally planned, and his father was not pleased with this. But at Oxford and in London, Bowdoin would have encountered collections of arts, including paintings, sculptures, prints, and drawings. And I'm showing here at left, not an example from the 18th century, but an earlier 17th century private collection, an example of a Wunderkammer, or cabinet of curiosities, which was primary means of collecting. At the time, it combined science, antiquities, and art. It's about the collecting and ordering of the world. You can see, in addition to the array of paintings behind, there are flowers, botanical specimens, as well as exotic animals and scientific instruments strewn about the room. And then at right, a print of a slightly later lecture at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, which is one of the earliest art museums, founded in 1683, formed from several donated cabinets of curiosities. Bowdoin could have also attended sales and exhibitions of art in London and Europe, being in Europe during a time period which was the beginning of these major public collections, which were intended for the public good, although with very restricted access. One had to occasionally write in and explain why you wanted to be allowed into the British Museum. During this time, James II writes letters complaining to his son about his prolific spending of money and not devoting himself to his education. And though we know he's traveling, probably experiencing art museums, there's no documented purchases. So he returns to Boston in April of 1772, and in fall of 1773, he sets sail for Italy with companion Ward Nicholas Boylston. And Ward Nicholas Boylston, who we see in a much later portrait at the right by Gilbert Stuart, was actually born Ward Hallowell, but he changed his name in order to receive an inheritance from his wealthy uncle, who we see at left in this absolutely fabulous portrait by John Singleton Copley. And later portraits of both Bowdoin and Boylston. So they left in October, arrived in Naples in the middle of January, and stayed for over a month. Thankfully, Boylston kept a travel diary that included all of their adventures, detailing visits, their companions, and that's now at the Massachusetts Historical Society. So I was able to read the entire diary. And during the time in Naples, they were escorted by a guide to major churches, art collections, as well as famous sites and monuments like Pompeii, Herculaneum, Pozzuoli, and Mount Vesuvius. Boylston recounts a fairly common experiment at the location seen at left, the Cave of Dogs at Pozzuoli, where they would literally take a dog, put it into this cave where there was carbon monoxide from a volcanic vent. The animal would pass out from lack of oxygen and then be revived by being dunked in water outside. Sometimes the dogs did not survive. They also visited Mount Vesuvius, seen here in a fabulous drawing from the McGuigan collection, which shows Sir William Hamilton, the British ambassador to the Kingdom of Naples, leading Sicilian royalty in a tour of the volcano, explaining what is happening. And Bowdoin and Boylston dined with Hamilton several times during their trip to Naples. Hamilton had amassed a very large collection of ancient vases, which he sold to the British Museum in 1772. And he was closely connected to the circle of artists in Naples who were coming from across Europe. Before the collection was sold, he had it published in a very lavish volume. We're looking at just two of the illustrations here, written by scholar and art dealer Pierre-François de Anquetil, with contributions by Johann Winckelmann, the German art historian and archaeologist, who was the prefect of antiquities for Pope Clement XIII. And this was a highly influential collection, especially these images. They were copied and used by artists across Europe. And it's very likely at this time that Bowdoin was introduced to Winckelmann's writings through Hamilton. And in fact, he later purchased the French translation of Winckelmann's History of Art and Antiquity that was published in 1794. The original German edition was in 1764. This became part of the library, donated to Bowdoin College. And Bowdoin had specifically requested that this book be purchased for him in 1809 while he was actively expanding his library in anticipation of donating it to Bowdoin College. And in the text, Winckelmann applies stylistic categories to art, establishing differences between Greek and Roman sculpture. And this is the actual volume at Bowdoin Library. But again, there's no mention of any art purchases in Boylston's diary. But in a letter to Bowdoin's sister, Elizabeth Temple, dated January 21st, soon after their arrival in Naples, he agreed to have his portrait painted for her at her request. And we believe that is the work here that's now at the museum, where we see him dressed in very fancy clothing against this very generic landscape background. We can't really tell exactly where it is, holding a book. And so this painting is indicating his status and his knowledge. Bowdoin and Boylston left Naples and arrived in Rome on March 12th, and Bowdoin wrote to his family asking that letters be directed to James Byers, a guide who worked for a number of travelers on the Grand Tour, who was also an art dealer. Notice the works hanging in the back of this family portrait. And when arriving in Rome, the tone of Boylston's diary changes. In Naples, there's very little mention of particular artists. He mostly talks about sites, churches, the collections that they visit. But arriving in Rome, he lists artists and works from each and every church and collection that they visit. So we're here looking at a few examples of sites: the Basilica of San Pietro, Palazzo Farnese, the Arch of Constantine, all of these documented in Boylston's diary. And in fact, at St. Peter's, he lists every chapel and every painting or sculpture within the church. Right? It's all very factual information. He records artist, date, so forth, but there's very little in terms of his response. We have no idea what he actually thought about these works of art or his particular interests. And he's just very clearly recording everything that James Byers is telling him. Boylston also interestingly notes different types of marble that they encounter at the site. And in fact, in the 1790s, both Boylston and Bowdoin gave gifts to Harvard University of marble tile samples, and this is the one from Bowdoin's collection. These were almost certainly purchased during their trip to Italy. And both Bowdoin and Boylston continued collecting geological and scientific specimens after their trip to Italy. The two companions parted in Rome. Bowdoin traveled to Florence, Bologna, France, and then finally England to stay with his sister. Boylston remained in Rome for another month and then moved east. He went to Turkey, Syria, and Egypt and begins to record purchases, mostly geological and botanical specimens, but he also bought a mummy while in Cairo. And he eventually moved to London with the intention of setting up as a merchant. Bowdoin returned to Boston in September 1775 at the insistence of his father, who again was demanding he stop spending a bunch of money and return home. And soon after married his cousin, Sarah Bowdoin. Although there's no record of art purchases, it's likely that he bought several works during his grand tour. There were paintings and drawings that were left with his sister Elizabeth. And in March 1784, so 9 years after he's returned, she wrote to him to complain about the cost of having to ship all of these works back to Boston and said, perhaps Mr. Christie could sell them instead. Thankfully, James III disagreed with this and the works were shipped back. So by the time he returned to Boston, he was well acquainted with collections and the idea of art showing status and importance. And one of the presumed works that he bought is this, it looks huge here, but it's a very small landscape, painted by a French artist who was working in Rome in the 1770s. It's a very typical work of an idealized view that would have been sold to a grand tour visitor. Bowdoin tried establishing himself in trade, but was not terribly successful, so he switched to a career in politics and diplomacy. And in 1804, he was appointed minister plenipotentiary to Spain. After his appointment, he wrote a letter of thanks to the president, Thomas Jefferson, and offered his services as a connoisseur of art, talking about his interest in art and the importance for status and experience. And one of the quotes from the letter, having been in Italy and having viewed the works of the best masters, if you would entrust me with your commissions, I would execute them to the best of my power. And he then offered Jefferson a gift of a sculpture, the copy of Ariadne, which is now at the Vatican Museum. And the original sculpture is life-size, but this is smaller. It's about 3 feet across. And in the letter, Bowdoin tells Jefferson that this sculpture was once owned by a Frenchman, but done after the original in Rome, which by 1805 was in France, taken by Napoleon. And it's almost certain that he bought this during the Grand Tour. There's no other time period where he could have acquired this work. And this gift to Jefferson was not just an act of gratitude or a bit of arrogance. Jefferson had argued for the importance of art for a newly established republic and educating society through that which is beautiful and noble. This is in complete contrast to authors like Benjamin Franklin, who saw industry as the primary importance rather than art. And a fabulous Franklin quote is, "The invention of a machine or the improvement of an implement is of more importance than a masterpiece by Raphael." So now we have a bit of evidence of Bowdoin as a collector, a little bit about his taste and understanding of art, but nothing on these drawings. So early scholarship and catalogs in the collection assume that all of the purchases were made during this diplomatic mission, where he was supposed to go to Spain, but he never actually made it to Spain. He spent 2 years in Paris negotiating with the French, who then controlled Spain, and the mission was basically a failure. But he and Sarah did return to Boston with the latest in French furnishings and decor, and their home became one of the most fashionable in the city. And he also bought paintings and likely some drawings, possibly the two that we are looking at here, which appear to be later 18th century, one in Rococo style at right, one in more Rococo at left, neoclassical at right, both by as yet unidentified artists. Sarah also kept a diary of their time in France, which is here at Bowdoin, where she recorded trips to palaces, art collections, and exhibitions. But at least a few of Bowdoin's drawings were from a very different source, the studio of John Smibert, a Scottish painter who settled in Boston in 1729. He had traveled to Italy in 1719, staying for over 2 years, working as a portraitist and making copies after works in Italian collections. In a notebook, he kept a recording of the works he made as well as purchases. And he lists at one point 250 drawings bought from a Signore Scacciati. This is likely a flower painter in Florence in 1720, who was a member of the Scacciati family. Smibert arrived in Boston at the request of George Berkeley to teach art at a seminary he planned to establish in Bermuda, which fell through. So Smibert was in Rhode Island with nowhere else to go and ended up returning to, or setting up a studio in Boston. So the portrait here celebrates the founding of this seminary that never actually happened. And Smibert's self-portrait is at far left in the brown coat. And he is holding in his hand a drawing, establishing his role as the artist for this enterprise, and also the importance of drawing, which was seen as the basis for other arts, and celebrating this as an intellectual activity, right, at the table where they're gathering around writing and discussing, rather than a manual craft. So Smibert, interestingly, did not make terribly many drawings as a portrait painter. He tended to work directly on canvas, but here he's showing himself with a drawing that represents a tree. This idea perhaps of establishing or planting the new college, a metaphor that was actually used in a poem by George Berkeley about the seminary. And the establishment of this college was under the guise of civilizing indigenous populations to save British society. And Berkeley saw training in the arts as just as relevant as training in rhetoric, public speaking. Could model ideal behaviors. And drawing, the act of drawing, learning how to draw, was actually part of education for nobility in Britain, mostly drawing landscapes. But this was not common in the early United States. All right, so Smibert established a studio in Boston in 1734 where he trained young artists, and he also welcomed other artists who wanted to study from his collection of copies of old master paintings, drawings, and plaster casts. He also ran a shop out of the studio, selling colors, oils, materials for painting fans, mezzotints, and prints, but not drawings. Smibert died in 1751. His nephew, John Moffat, inherited the estate and studio, and the contents were then sold in 1778 after Moffat's death. James Bowden III, by this point, is friendly with the artist John Trumbull, who took over the studio. And it's at this point that he likely purchased works in the sale, including this painting, The Continents of Scipio, which is after a work by Nicholas Poussin that is now in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. And in the painting, we see a Roman general who has won a battle and is giving back the spoils of war. It's an act of generosity. And we're 100% sure that Bowden bought some drawings at this point because there are 4 drawings that are clearly connected to Smibert. There are 3 drawings at Bowden that have an inscription saying John Smibert. Thought at one point to be possibly identifying the artist, but absolutely incorrect. So at far left, we have a late 16th century Italian drawing representing the fall of Icarus, and then a late 17th to early 18th century caricature, which was once thought to be a caricature of Duke Cosimo III de' Medici, done by Smibert himself, but it is very much not. And then a late 16th century northern drawing that's a design for a dish. Additionally, at right is a drawing by Tommaso Redi, which is also on view here, who was a Florentine artist. Smibert is recorded purchasing a painting from Redi, and it's likely he either bought the drawing or was gifted the drawing by the artist at the time. There was no inventory taken at Smibert's death, so we cannot be sure how many works were bought from the artist and how many were purchased by Bowden himself in Europe. But additional evidence comes from the drawings themselves. It's likely that many of the drawings were mounted, meaning glued to paper with inscriptions and decorative framing lines. About 40 of these mounts were preserved after a conservation effort in the early 80s, and a number are still in the object files here at the college, and we have one on view to actually see. And it's unclear exactly how many of these drawings were mounted. Unfortunately, this has just not been recorded. The mounts are made of laid paper, so this handmade paper, so they're likely dating to earlier than the 19th century. Most have framing lines that include attributions written in a very elegant script, as you can see at the bottom of these two drawings. And this is part of a long established tradition dating back to the 16th century. The earliest known example is Giorgio Vasari, an artist who was also the first biographer of artists and one of the founders, really, of art history. In parallel with his writing project, Vasari collected drawings by the artists discussed in his text. The first edition was published in 1550, the second expanded edition in 1568. And the drawings that he purchased, he had mounted with these incredibly elaborate frames and framing lines. And these sheets are large. They're around 2 feet tall each. Right? And these were bound in folios that he referred to as the Libro dei Disegni. And he references the libro in the biography. So when he's talking about the artist, he's literally like, you can go see the drawings that I've collected in the libro. And this is part of a massive project to elevate drawing, design, disegno, as the primary basis for art, and to elevate the status of the artist as an intellectual rather than manual craftsman. This practice continued, right? Mostly, but instead of artists like Vasari, it becomes mostly nobility and collectors. Drawing collections were then almost books on the history and development of art. Visitors and fellow collectors could look through sheets, discussing the artist's skill, changes in style over time, differences between different schools, as well as the collector's taste and judgment. And here we're looking at 2 examples from 18th century France. Pierre-Jean Mariette at left, who uses wash and these different colored papers to create an almost 3-dimensional effect around the drawings. And then at right, Comte de Saint-Maury, who creates the effect of actual frames. If you can see in the corners, there's a very faint line drawn, so it's almost like this frame is a literal physical frame around the drawing. Looking at the mounts for Boden's drawings, the inscriptions are almost certainly written by an English speaker based on the spellings, and additional notations including, I'm sorry, it's impossible to read and I don't have a good photograph of it, but on this mount it says died 1530, so very clearly an English speaker writing. And the approach to these framing lines is very close in style to Jonathan Richardson Sr., an early 18th century English artist, collector, and art theorist who argued for the study of drawings to improve the mind. So not just for artists, but by collectors. By looking at these works, you could better understand history in general. Boden or Smibert could have seen drawings from Richardson's collection at sales and auctions at the time. And mounting, framing, labeling, adding to albums were all part of the display of drawings and therefore the display of knowledge. You could research and classify drawings, determining attribution and gathering all of these works together. Right. Additionally, there were watermarks on many of the mounts, both examples of mounts that include the more elaborate framing lines and others that don't have them. And I'm just showing one example of one of these watermarks known as the Maid of Dort, which was popular in Dutch and English paper mills in the 18th century. It's possible that Smybert mounted the drawings in preparation for serving as the art instructor for Berkeley's college, but this would have been unusual. This is not something that artists really did in the 18th century. Most drawings collected by artists were for studio use, meant to be copied and studied by students, just like the Raphael drawing that we began the lecture with, and would serve as inspiration for his own work. The decorative framing lines were generally for wealthy collectors. So it's likely that Bowden himself had these made or purchased works from another collection that were already mounted this way. Just want to do a very brief overview of the collection, which includes at least 10 counterproofs, a topic that is near and dear to me right now as I'm working for the McGuigan collection on 2 albums of counterproofs. And a counterproof is made by taking a sheet of blank paper, wetting it, and pressing it against the original drawing. And it then creates an impression on the new sheet. Often this can be done through a printing press, and this is most common with red chalk, as in the 2 examples we've seen here. And in the 18th century, it was suggested in drawing manuals that artists should create a counterproof because it helps set the medium. Red chalk is more friable than black chalk, and it prevents the original drawing from rubbing. So then the image is reversed and becomes slightly faded or faint. And you can see the sort of a little bit more of the flatness, but also in this drawing attributed to Agostino Masuccio at the right, you'll notice the Christ child is blessing with his left hand and not his right hand. So the fact that there's 10 counterproofs in the collection is unusually high. It's possible that Bowden actually sought these out. And the idea of originality and copy was very different in the 18th century as we think of it today. And in fact, counterproofs were considered highly valuable, sometimes selling for more than the original drawings. There's also a number of biblical scenes, around 65, almost half of which are images of the Virgin and Child or the visitation, the moment when the Virgin Mary, pregnant with Christ child, meets her cousin Elizabeth, who is pregnant with St. John the Baptist, also through a miracle. And it's possible that these particular scenes were chosen because James Bowden III and Sarah never had any children. So it seems a particularly poignant choice of mother and child and miraculous pregnancy for a couple that never had any children. There's also a number of landscapes, about 25, and mythological subjects, 30, which I wish I could spend more time, but I'm gonna try to not spend an entire hour. So we'll go into very quickly copies after known works. We've already talked about the Raphael school drawing after Donatello, and this lovely drawing after a painting by Poussin, which is not a direct copy, it's actually free. There are some changes made to the figures. So drawings like this could serve as substitutes for the famous originals, so reproductions from which Bowden and then students could learn. And the study of art was part of classical education. It was thought that you could then understand history, proper behavior, but also gain aesthetic knowledge. And as I've mentioned, looking at drawings was meant to be a group activity. This was recommended in manuals and texts since the 17th century. The viewing of art in general was a social activity. You were meant to sit around and discuss, right? It's a place for discussion, displaying knowledge, seeing new things every single time. And Bowden himself kept his drawings in his library. They were cataloged there in 1811 by John Abbott with the rest of the books, all of which were purchased by James Bowden III, because remember, his father's library had been donated to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, so Bowden had to start from scratch. And Abbott was sent by the college to take the inventory after the death of James III, who never actually visited the site of Bowden College. He provided finances and donated these works of art. And he wanted these drawings and paintings to be seen and experienced by these students who were members of a privileged class and could also appreciate Bowden's taste and skills as a collector and connoisseur. His library included 2,000 books and these 2 folios of drawings recorded here. So I don't know if it's possible to see, but it's a collection of drawings, folio large, collection of drawings, small folio. And the library, with all of these thousands of books, made Bowdoin College the 3rd largest university library in New England at the time. So it was a huge influx. And included at least 2 books that were purchased during the Grand Tour and relate to art in Rome. One of which is a series of prints after the Column of Trajan by Pietro Santi Bartoli, a later 17th century artist who specialized in copies after antiquity. So this is just one plate from this very fabulous volume. He also purchased another volume by Pietro Ferrerio of Palaces of Rome. And these 2 books could have served as reminders of the monuments he visited and could then be shared with students at the college who may not ever make it on the Grand Tour. He owned other art books. We've already talked about Winkelmann, but he also had several on architecture and art theory. So the books and the drawings were kept in folios in the library until the opening of the Walker Building in 1894, when the drawings were framed and put on display. But these drawings were known. They were meant to be models of instruction. It's why Bowdoin donated these to the college. And it was thought for a number of years that these drawings were forgotten, literally wasting away in the library, undiscovered, until a student happened upon them in 1881. However, they're recorded in multiple library catalogs throughout the 19th century and mentioned in an article from Art Journal in 1880. The article lists some of the older attributions, singles out a few drawings in particular, including this study of a woman and child, which you can see at the bottom right corner. It says Tintoretto, so it was believed to be a drawing by Jacopo Tintoretto, which very much was not. It's a copy after. But in the article, it actually talks about the relevance to education. But of course, this is an education that was restricted to men of a certain class who were meant to be future leaders of the newly established republic. In fact, the article begins by mentioning illustrious men connected to Bowdoin and to Maine in general. In the 1817 laws of the college, one of the quotes is, "It is incumbent on every student to be not only a Christian and a scholar, but a gentleman." And studying works of art, including these drawings, understanding old masters through their draftsmanship, was part of this gentlemanly education. And of course, understanding drawing trains your perception as well. It helps you understand and think through the world. This is actually discussed in a manual by the artist Rembrandt Peale, published in 1835. And for students at Bowdoin, these drawings, including different subjects, could not only help them become proper connoisseurs, cultivated gentlemen, but it could impart lessons on morality. Think of the painting of Continence of Scipio that we discussed, and the Domenico Beccafumi drawing. The article also mentions that King Chapel, which was finished in the 1850s, then housed the library with paintings from the collection. So the drawings and the paintings were actually in the same building at this point in time. But then, of course, the works were taken out of the folios when this fabulous building was opened in 1894, and we are lucky to have a photograph documenting how the drawings were displayed. You can see they were all framed and placed on a rail, just like these here, so that students and visitors could see them with the paintings, which was perhaps not the best choice for conservation. That's a skylight that has no UV filters above. But the drawings were there. They were meant to be viewed and seen. And I just want to end looking at a drawing from the fantastic Jim Dine exhibition, and another by Bernardino Pochetti that is also on view here, where the idea of drawing is this creative process. But it's not just that, it's about forging bonds, these connections as you discuss things together, that it's still relevant today. All right, thank you. Okay. Sorry.
To take questions.
Oh, yes, sorry. Good to hear. Absolutely.
And we have microphones for the video recording.
Sarah, thanks for a wonderful chat. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about where a collector would buy a drawing. Were there galleries, auctions? Where would you go to actually buy these works?
Auction houses, but then guides like James Byers would have bought either from artists, from other collectors, and he could have purchased from other collectors as well, but this is before we have really established galleries. And we know somebody like John Smibert was certainly buying directly from other artists. So Bowdoin could have had access that way. But it is entirely possible that these came from auctions from other collections.
Susan? Okay. Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. Very nice. I was intrigued by that inventory that you showed, and you picked out the two lines saying large folio, small folio. Does this indicate to you that these drawings had been placed into a book, that they were bound together, or it's just the size?
I think it's the size, but the folio could be, and there are different ways of storing drawings. They could be bound in an album, and they would have sometimes smaller drawings mounted together on a page, similar to what Vasari did with the Libro, but at usually a much smaller scale. But these could just sort of be binders that would hold these loose drawings together. But we don't have any evidence that they were officially bound in volumes, but it seems likely that it was sort of a folio case, and the loose sheets were kept together, and one was of one size, one was of a smaller size.
Can I ask a question as someone who's interested in German studies? Because you mentioned earlier on Winkelmann and his important revelations about classical studies. And Goethe, who was in Rome in the late 1780s, was definitely influenced by Winkelmann. And Parker Cleveland, the science professor at Bowdoin in 1820s, corresponded with Goethe, and Goethe felt he was the leading scientist in America. So my question is, did Bowdoin have anything to do with Goethe?
Oh, that's a good question. I haven't looked if he owned any volumes, but we have the inventory of the library, so it's certainly easy enough to check to see if he would have had any volumes, if he would have sought them out. Because again, most of the library was purchased with the intention of donating to the college. Like, it wasn't just his own interests. He was really thinking about these as future education. But we don't have any evidence that they met Goethe, and Boylston would have certainly recorded, right? Writes down every single person that they meet.
So because of Winkelmann and Goethe, I'm curious, did he, because his knowledge of French and interest in Spain, were there any German artists or colonies, because there was a whole colony of German artists in Rome, that he met or talked about?
We don't have evidence of this, but it's been a while since I've looked at Boylston's travel diary. He doesn't really mention particular artists that they meet. It's mostly sort of nobility and collectors, right, talking to clergy as well, but it's worth checking. It's not something I've looked into in detail, and that's actually a big part of my current project, is looking at an English artist who was very closely connected to the circle of German artists in the late 1780s and 1790s in Naples and in Rome. So, yeah.
There's a question back here.
Yeah.
Great job, Sarah. Thanks.
Thanks, John.
The third drawing on the left, which was your last slide, appears to have a collector stamp.
It does.
What did you learn about collector stamps from these drawings?
So it's impossible to see. Everybody has to get up and take a look. It has PL on here, which is Sir Peter Lely, who was a 17th century Dutch artist who settled in London and was a famous portrait painter, but also a major collector of drawings. And collector's stamps are these marks that are literally stamped onto drawings by collectors starting in really the 17th century and become very large and important in the 18th century. And it allows us to trace the provenance. So we know certainly this drawing was in England and it was owned by Sir Peter Lely. And in the course of my research on collector's marks for the Bowden drawings, we actually discovered one that was not published in the Luth catalog, L-U-G-T. Fritz Luth, in the early 20th century, put together the basically Bible of collector's marks that still exist in an online catalog today and is updated. So I was able to send an image of this mark that is now online, right, and noted which drawing it was from.
I'm getting the impression of James Bowden as a dilettante who used his father's money to buy. You know, I want you to correct it. Or, did he work? Did he?
As a diplomat, he attempted to become a merchant, but it didn't work out. So he mostly was living off of family funds, so far as I could tell. Anybody else could correct me.
But should we give him a lot of credit for using these family funds
Yes.
to buy books and
Absolutely.
and drawings that did he intend from the beginning to give them to Bowdoin College?
I don't think in terms of the art collection. The art collection was this is what you did. As a son of the gentry, you were supposed to collect, you were supposed to gather these works, you were supposed to know about them and be able to talk about them. So his father really only had the family portraits commissioned and bought a few copies of old master paintings, but it was more these are the things you put on your wall because that's what you do. And I think for James III, this is about establishing his own identity and portraying himself as truly knowledgeable. And the letter to Jefferson is just fabulous to read. The way he sort of talks about, well, you know, I've been to Italy and I've spent some time with so many old master works, but I'm not a true expert. However, and then he offers his services, right, which Jefferson never took him up on. He did take the Ariadne, which is still at Monticello today, but he didn't make any purchases for Jefferson during the time. But I think with his library, obviously he had to collect books because his father gave all of their books away. They left with this massive library in the home in Boston with completely empty shelves. So he had to start filling it. But by the early 1800s, he's clearly starting to think of what is my legacy going to be, right? His father helped found the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Bowden began looking for opportunities, and he was approached actually by people setting up Bowdoin College, and they asked if he wanted to be involved, and this then became his goal, really. And as we know for sure, he was collecting books that were intended for the students, that he may not have even read himself.
Do we know of other young men who went on the tour and then came home and eventually donated to colleges?
So Boylston, but not art. Boylston kind of took the approach of Benjamin Franklin that art really was for just sort of aesthetic pleasure and not educational value. He commissioned family portraits, right? We have the portrait by Gilbert Stuart, but he made an effort to collect scientific specimens and also medical instruments and donated his collection to Harvard's Medical College. But other young men were certainly collecting and donating to colleges. Boden, however, we know is the very first to donate drawings. This is the first collection of drawings in the United States, the first at a university as well.
Sarah, this is absolutely fascinating. And Ellie, I love your question. Thank you so much. I was going to ask something similar, but since you asked the question about the college and the collecting of drawings and books, which I think is fascinating, I would like to ask Sarah whether your study of Boden and collecting leads you to have the impression that Boden's tastes developed or evolved over the course of his lifetime. And so it is interesting that he's somebody who traveled to Europe when he was very young, before he had really totally finished college, somebody who's back a little bit later, and then somebody who's back as a much more mature person. So I'd love to know how you see his tastes developing. And then I'm also curious, given the fact that he did work for Jefferson, whether you think there's any dimension of politics in addition to thinking about ideas.
Yeah, oh, that's a great question. I think it definitely changed. I mean, I don't think he set out for England in 1770 to become an art collector. He really intended to go to Oxford and study law, right, and actually have a profession, but then decided he would sort of rather learn gentlemanly pursuits, fencing and French. And I think it's at this point that he becomes interested really in art and understands these collections that are developing in England in the 18th century. And I wish more than anything else that we had a travel diary from Boden as well as Boylston. And in fact, his father asked him to keep a diary, but he never followed through. But he was clearly influenced by this trip and learning about old master artists, learning about drawing, painting, sculpture, right, different types of marble. And that carries through. Even if we don't have really documented evidence of works that he bought, we can guess that he probably purchased things. And he certainly purchased something because, again, his sister complains about having to shell out quite a bit of money to ship them to Boston. And then I think when he's in France, he is thinking about the political angle and looking for works that are relevant, particularly in books. And there's a fabulous essay in The Legacy of the James Boden III volume from
1994.
That talks about how he was specifically buying books related to the political situation in Europe at the time. And he's thinking about how these could connect to what's happening back home.
Are there any other questions? Sabrina?
I just had a question about viewing the drawings and how that inspired conversation and education, and how exactly who and where and.
So I know this is, so the 18th century is generally outside my particular area of expertise, but I'm slowly getting more and more into this. In the 17th century, we know it was other collectors and nobility. I have evidence of the artist I wrote my dissertation on, his paintings being viewed in this way. So the people who commissioned works, gathering their friends, other members of the nobility around to literally talk about art. And that was part of just standard society at the time, at least the upper class society as well. But for Bowden, he certainly would have realized this during the Grand Tour, because he would have been taken around to these collections in Naples and in Rome, and the guide would have talked through what they were looking at and would have asked, Bowden's and Boylston's thoughts. It wouldn't have just been a straight lecture, but a discussion. It wasn't meant to be just, we talk at you, but you're involved in this.
Oh, I forgot. Sarah, this has been so fascinating. Before we let you go, although we want to be sensitive to the time, I wonder if you might be willing to just say a word or two, yes, about the drawings that you've brought forward for us to.
I selected these because some of them are a few of my favorites and ones that are of particular importance. So this is actually a German artist, Friedrich Sustris, but we have the original mount. And so this is the mount for the drawing. This was originally glued to. And you can see it does not say Sustris at the bottom. It says Porino del Vaga, a 16th century Italian artist. And this brings up interesting history of attribution, right? And in the object files and in catalogs, we have records of scholars coming to the museum, looking at these drawings and saying, oh, that's definitely not this artist. I think it's this artist. And so we have this not just a discussion at James Bowden point in time, right, in the 18th, 19th century about these drawings, but this is a conversation that continues through time and is still happening today. I think some of the attributions have changed even since I was working on the catalog. And then the Raphael studio copy that I've talked about. This is Bernardino Poccetti. This is a study for a fresco in Florence at the Church of Santissima Annunziata. And it's just a quick sketch of a few figures, but I was always struck by this drawing because it's worked in two colors of chalk. So you have the red and the black contrasting with each other. And you can see in the background he has others just very quickly sketched in figures. So this is an early study where he's working through ideas, just of a very small section of one of these very large frescoes. And then the Tommaso Redi, which we now know came from Smeibert's collection. Smeibert bought a painting by this artist, and again, he could have been gifted the drawing or purchased it at the time. I think more likely a gift because he recorded every purchase. So it would make sense that Redi would have given this. And this is red chalk, but it's interesting to look at up close because it's two colors of red chalk. It's two different types within the same drawing. This is Abraham Diepenbach. I apologize for my Dutch pronunciation. I speak Italian and French. I do not, Dutch is not one of them. And I was struck because there are actually 3 drawings by this artist, and they came in with these attributions. He's not a terribly well-known 17th century Dutch artist, but he was very popular. And he made a number of drawings. This is actually a study for a painting, but he also did studies for prints as well. And there's another drawing in the collection that is a study for a frontispiece for a book. And it's one of 2 drawings for frontispieces that Bowden likely purchased. And then finally, because I'm a 17th century landscape scholar, this is Giovanni Francesco Grimaldi, an artist from Bologna. And this drawing is fascinating because it's actually a copy after another drawing by Annibale Carracci, another Bolognese artist who Grimaldi knew very well. And we know that the original is in Budapest. So you can make comparisons between this and the first drawing. And we know Grimaldi worked with the Carracci family before striking out on his own and becoming one of the major landscape painters in Italy in the 17th century. Sorry. Yes?
I understood that you said so many copies of it was sort of piece of paper. Press it up against the original red chalk. Doesn't that really Doesn't that really mess up the first copy?
Amazingly, it doesn't. It actually was common to do for red chalk because red chalk is a very friable medium, meaning it doesn't adhere fully to the paper, but when you create a counterproof, it actually makes the chalk fully bind with the paper and it makes it so the surface won't rub. And this is something that was really common in 18th century France, where red chalk was an incredibly popular medium because they realized if you didn't do a counterproof, you could actually damage the original drawing. And artists like Antoine Watteau, Jean-André Fragonard were famous for creating counterproofs. And again, it's a catalog or auction catalog for that lists Edmé Bouchardon drawings, and it's entertaining to see that some of the Bouchardon counterproofs, which are identified as such, sold for more than some of the original drawings. So these weren't considered just, studio copies. These were works in their own right that had value, which is part of the work I'm doing right now, talking about the importance and function of counterproofs.
Thank you.
Was it very usual to do work in two different,
Catherine?
or did you just, one crayon broke and
It's entirely possible, but in the 17th century, we do see some more, and there's artists like Federico Barocci, who often worked in multiple colors of chalk at a time. But it's not as common as just working in one color of chalk. So this is I find it a really striking drawing as well.
How many counterproofs could you make before you?
Oh, that's a good. No, something we're trying to figure out. It seems that you could make multiple counterproofs, but each time you make a counterproof, the resulting proof becomes fainter and fainter, and the original drawing can eventually become damaged. But you can also make a counterproof of a counterproof if it's done early enough. So then you end up with the original orientation of the drawing. And counterproofs were often used in printmaking, right? Because you would then have the original drawing that's printed reverse, and then that's transferred to the plate. So then when you print, it's in the orientation of the original image. Any other questions?
Sarah, please join me in thanking Sarah Pantos. Sarah, we thank you so much for illuminating the history of James Bowdoin III's amazing collection and the circumstances behind it. But we also thank you so much for helping us to see these drawings today in a new light. And I partially wanted to pause now in case people want to have an opportunity to speak further with Sarah and to spend a little bit more time with these drawings.
Please come and look at the drawings.
We're so glad you're all here with us today. Thank you for joining us.